Imagine pulling up to a party in 1936 in a car that looks like it landed from another century. No hood jutting out in front of you, no running boards, no chrome grille grinning like a chrome-plated bulldog. Just a smooth, rounded shell of metal, long and low and utterly alien, gliding silently to a stop, while every other car on the street looks like a relic from the horse and buggy era by comparison. The door swings open, and inside, instead of a cramped bench seat and a steering wheel shoved into your chest, there is a living room. Rotating chairs, a folding table, a flat floor you could practically dance on. And the engine? Somewhere in the back, out of sight, out of mind, humming quietly where the trunk used to be. This was not a concept car. This was not a prototype built to impress shareholders at a boardroom meeting. This was a real automobile, built by one man, driven on real American roads, and owned by 9 of the most powerful industrialists in the country. And almost nobody today knows it ever existed. The man behind it was William Bushnell Stout. And if you have never heard that name, that is precisely the problem this story is here to fix. Because Stout was not some garage tinkerer dreaming of the future over a cup of coffee. He was one of the most accomplished aeronautical engineers in the United States. A man who had already changed the face of aviation before he ever turned his attention to the automobile. Born in 1880, Stout grew up in an era when the very idea of mechanical flight was considered the domain of madmen and dreamers. He became both, in the best possible sense. By the time the Wright brothers had barely gotten off the ground at Kitty Hawk, Stout was already writing about the future of transportation with the confidence of someone who had seen blueprints from the year 2000. He started his career as a journalist and technical writer, which gave him something most engineers sorely lack: the ability to explain a revolutionary idea to someone who does not want to understand it. He wrote about aviation before most Americans had ever seen an airplane. He sketched designs for all-metal aircraft when wood and canvas were still considered perfectly adequate. And when he decided to stop writing about the future and start building it, he did not waste any time. In 1922, Stout founded the Stout Metal Airplane Company in Detroit, right in the heart of the American industrial machine. He raised money from the most powerful names in American business, Henry Ford included, by sending out letters promising investors that they would likely lose every dollar they put in, but that the work would be worth doing anyway. It was one of the most audacious fundraising pitches in American history, and it worked. Ford eventually bought Stout's company outright in 1925, and out of that partnership came the Ford Trimotor, the aircraft Americans called the Tin Goose. It was a corrugated, all-metal monoplane that could carry passengers in a semblance of comfort, and it became the backbone of early American commercial aviation. Charles Lindbergh flew one. Admiral Richard Byrd used one to fly over the South Pole in 1929. The Tin Goose did not just move people through the air. It convinced an entire generation of Americans that air travel was something other than a death wish. Stout did not merely contribute to that era, he helped create it. But Stout was never the type to stay satisfied. By the early 1930s, with aviation advancing faster than even he could manage, his mind drifted back to the ground. And what he saw on American roads genuinely troubled him. The automobile, in his view, was a deeply irrational machine. It had a massive engine bolted to the front for no particularly good reason, a body shaped to accommodate that engine rather than the people inside it, and a layout that wasted enormous amounts of interior space on mechanical necessity. Drivers sat behind a wall of iron and steel, peering over a hood that served no purpose except to house a power plant that could just as easily live somewhere else. Stout had spent years designing aircraft around the principle that every gram of weight must justify its existence, that structure and function must be unified without compromise, and that the passenger, not the engine, was the point of the exercise. Looking at the American automobile through those eyes, he saw an industry that had built an entire civilization on on a fundamentally flawed idea. He was not alone in thinking this. The 1930s were a remarkable period of automotive experimentation, a decade when designers and engineers across America and Europe were genuinely questioning whether the conventional car layout made any sense at all. Buckminster Fuller was building his Dymaxion car, a three-wheeled, rear-engined torpedo that terrified everyone who rode in it. Paul Jarre in Europe was applying aerodynamics to automobile bodies, with results that looked decades ahead of their time. The Czech company Tatra was putting air-cooled engines in the tail of their cars with an elegance that would later, famously, inspire Ferdinand Porsche. The air was thick with radical ideas, and Stout breathed all of it in. What made Stout different from the dreamers was that he had both the engineering credentials and the industrial connections to actually build something. He had spent years inside the Ford empire, understood manufacturing, understood materials, and understood, crucially, that an idea is worthless until it exists in 3 dimensions and can be driven down the road. So in 1932, he began working on what would become the Stout Scarab, and he approached the project with the same systematic ruthlessness he had applied to aircraft design. The car would be rear-engined, eliminating the hood entirely and freeing up the interior. The floor would be completely flat, because there would be no drive shaft tunnel running beneath the passengers. The body would be a genuine monocoque structure, the shell itself providing the strength, just as in aircraft construction. And the whole thing would be shaped not by stylistic convention, but by aerodynamic logic. A smooth, rounded form that cut through air rather than fighting it. The name he chose was perfect. The scarab was an ancient Egyptian beetle, a symbol of transformation and regeneration. An insect that rolls a ball of dung into gold, metaphorically speaking. It was also, not coincidentally, shaped something like the car itself, compact, rounded, with its mass centered low and rearward. Whether Stout chose the name for its symbolism or its shape, or simply because it sounded unlike anything else on a dealership floor in 1936, is a question nobody can fully answer today. But it suited the machine perfectly. By 1935, the first prototype was running. And what Stout had built was so far outside the experience of anyone who saw it that reactions ranged from genuine astonishment to polite bewilderment to outright disbelief. This was not a car that required a second glance. It required a full stop, a walk around, a peer through the windows, and a long moment of silence while the brain caught up with what the eyes were reporting. The first thing you noticed when you walked up to a Stout Scarab was the absence of everything you expected to see. No hood, no separate fenders curving out over the wheels like chrome eyebrows, no running boards, no radiator grille presenting itself like the face of a Victorian gentleman. The Scarab was a single, unbroken form, a teardrop stretched over 4 wheels, its nose rounded and low, its roofline flowing back without interruption into a tail that housed the engine. It looked less like a car and more like something that had been inflated from the inside until it found its natural shape. Standing next to a 1936 Packard or a Cadillac Fleetwood, the Scarab did not merely look different. It looked like it had arrived from a different civilization entirely. The body construction was itself a statement of Stout's aeronautical obsession. He used an aluminium and magnesium alloy for significant structural components, materials that were standard in aircraft but almost unheard of in automobile manufacturing at the time. The average American car of that era was built around a heavy, separate steel chassis, a ladder frame onto which the body was bolted, like a house onto a foundation. Stout threw that entire philosophy out. The Scarab used a unitized body structure, where the shell and the frame were one integrated whole, each reinforcing the other, the way a fuselage works. This was not just clever engineering. In 1936, for an automobile, it was essentially science fiction made metal. Underneath that revolutionary skin sat a Ford V8 engine, the flathead unit that Ford had introduced in 1932 and that had already become the beating heart of American hot rod culture. But where every other car in America placed that engine up front, Stout mounted it in the rear, behind the rear axle, where its weight helped traction, and its absence from the front of the car liberated an astonishing amount of interior space. The wheelbase was generous, the overhangs minimal, and the result was that virtually the entire length of the car between the axles was available for passengers. No engine tunnel, no firewall eating into the footwell, no hood stretching 3 feet ahead of the driver like a ship's prow. Just space, clean and democratic, and completely unlike anything Detroit was selling. And that interior. This is where the Scarab stops being a curiosity and becomes something genuinely visionary. Step inside, and you did not find a bench seat and a gear shift. You found individual chairs, proper chairs, upholstered and comfortable, that could rotate to face each other. A folding table could be deployed between them, the kind of arrangement you might find in a first-class railway carriage. The floor was completely flat, uninterrupted by any mechanical intrusion, which sounds unremarkable today and was absolutely staggering in 1936. Every car of that era forced passengers to straddle a transmission tunnel or perch awkwardly above the chassis members. Stout simply eliminated the problem at the source. The Scarab was, by any honest measure, the first minivan. Not in size, not in marketing, but in the fundamental idea that a car's interior should be organized around the comfort and convenience of the people inside it, rather than the mechanical requirements of the drivetrain. Chrysler would not reach the same conclusion for another 48 years. The price Stout set for the Scarab was $5,000. To understand what that meant in 1936, consider that a brand new Ford V8 sedan, already considered a well-equipped, respectable automobile, cost around $600. A modest family home in the American Midwest could be purchased for $3,000. Stout was asking his customers to spend more than most American families earned in 3 or 4 years, during the deepest economic depression the country had ever experienced. It was an audacious number, and Stout was entirely unapologetic about it, because the men he was selling to did not notice the difference between $5,000 and $600. William Wrigley Jr., heir to the chewing gum empire that had plastered its name across every ballpark and corner store in America, bought one. Harvey Firestone Jr., whose family had built the tire industry into a national institution, and whose rubber supplied the very wheels on which every American car rolled, bought one. Edsel Ford, son of Henry, president of the Ford Motor Company, a man of genuine aesthetic sophistication in an industry that often confused chrome with beauty, was deeply interested in the project, though his father's company had its own products to sell. Dow Chemical was represented among the owners, which made a certain poetic sense, given that Stout had used Dow's magnesium alloys in the car's construction. These were not wealthy eccentrics indulging a whim. These were the architects of American industrial civilization, and they recognized in the Scarab something that the general public was not yet equipped to see. The press reaction was electric, and slightly baffled in equal measure. Motor Trend did not yet exist, but the automotive journalists of the era descended on the Scarab with the mixture of excitement and confusion that genuinely new things always produce. Some called it the car of the future. Some called it grotesque. The New York Times covered its debut with the kind of attention usually reserved for political events or natural disasters. Stout himself was a gifted showman. Remember, he had started his career as a writer, and he understood perfectly how to generate coverage. He drove the Scarab to exhibitions, parked it next to conventional automobiles, and let the contrast do the talking. The car needed no salesman. It was its own argument. What Stout told anyone who would listen was simple, and turned out to be either brilliantly prescient or heartbreakingly optimistic, depending on how you look at it. He predicted that within 3 to 4 years, every major American manufacturer would be building cars on the same principles: rear engine, flat floor, unified body, interior designed for people rather than machinery. He said it with the certainty of a man who had watched aviation transform, from biplanes to all-metal monoplanes, in a single decade. and assumed that automobiles would follow the same ruthless logic of progress. He was describing the 1980s. He just thought he was describing 1940. Stout's prediction did not age well in the short term, and the reasons why tell you everything about the difference between being right and being right at the right moment. Detroit in the late 1930s was not a place that rewarded radical thinking. It was a place that rewarded incremental refinement of proven formulas, obsessive attention to what buyers had already demonstrated they would pay for, and an almost theological respect for the established relationship between a car's hood length and its perceived social standing. In American culture of that era, a long hood was not merely an aesthetic preference. It was a declaration. It told everyone on the street exactly how much money you had spent and how seriously you expected to be taken. To a Packard buyer in 1937, a car without a hood was not a vision of the future. It was a car that looked unfinished, like someone had forgotten to attach the most important part. This was not stupidity on the part of the buying public. It was the entirely reasonable application of a visual grammar that the industry had spent 3 decades teaching people to read fluently. When you purchased a Cadillac or a Lincoln or a Packard 12, you were acquiring a set of signals that strangers could decode at 50 yards. The sweep of the fenders communicated something. The height of the radiator communicated something. The chrome details and the proportion of glass to steel communicated something. Stout had built a car that communicated nothing in that language because it had been composed in a completely foreign one, and in 1936, almost nobody in America had been taught the vocabulary. The timing compounded everything. The Great Depression had not finished its work on the American economy when the Scarab appeared. Unemployment had devastated entire communities, and the psychological aftermath, the deep, bone-level anxiety about money and security that the Depression left in an entire generation, meant that even wealthy Americans were cautious about conspicuous extravagance that could not be easily explained. $5,000 for a car that looked like nothing else on the road was a hard sell even to men who could afford it without blinking. It required a buyer who was not merely rich, but genuinely intellectually adventurous, willing to drive something that would draw stares and questions rather than the comfortable recognition that a Packard or a Cadillac guaranteed. The 9 men who bought Scarabs were exactly that kind of buyer. The problem was that there were only 9 of them. Stout understood the commercial failure clearly enough, and his response was characteristically energetic. He did not retreat to his workshop and sulk. He went on the offensive, approaching the major manufacturers with proposals for bringing the Scarab's principles to a volume production vehicle at an accessible price point. His argument was technically coherent and economically interesting. The unitized body construction he had used could, at sufficient scale, be cheaper to produce than the traditional body-on-frame approach because it eliminated the separate chassis entirely and reduced the total number of structural components. He calculated that a rear-engine, flat-floor family car could be built and sold profitably at a price competitive with mainstream offerings from Ford and General Motors. He presented these arguments to anyone in Detroit who would sit still long enough to hear them. The response was polite, thorough, and ultimately useless. The problem was not that the executives disagreed with his engineering logic. Several of them privately found it compelling. The problem was institutional. General Motors had spent hundreds of millions of dollars tooling its factories for conventional, front-engine, body-on-frame construction. Ford's entire River Rouge complex, one of the largest industrial facilities in human history at that point, was organized around producing exactly the kind of car that Stout was arguing against. To scrap that investment and retool for a completely different manufacturing philosophy was not an engineering decision. It was an act of corporate self-destruction that no board of directors was going to authorize on the strength of 9 hand-built prototypes, however elegant. There was also a genuine engineering problem lurking beneath the Scarab's brilliant concept, one that Stout's aeronautical instincts had not fully resolved. Mounting the engine behind the rear axle created a weight distribution that demanded exceptional skill from the driver in anything other than straight-line travel. In corners, particularly at speed, The heavy rear end wanted to continue in the direction it had been going, regardless of what the front wheels were instructed to do. This phenomenon, oversteer in the clinical language of vehicle dynamics, was manageable in a car designed by a master and driven carefully, but it was not the kind of characteristic that a mainstream American family vehicle could afford to have. The tire technology and suspension geometry of the 1930s were not sophisticated enough to tame it gracefully, and Stout knew it. It was one more reason why the Scarab remained a vision statement rather than a production reality.
What makes this failure genuinely tragic, rather than merely unfortunate, is that the men who rejected Stout's proposals went on, in the following decades, to independently rediscover every single principle he had demonstrated. Front-wheel drive, which eliminates the driveshaft tunnel and creates a flat floor through a different mechanical approach, began its conquest of the mainstream market in the 1960s and 70s. Unitized body construction became universal in passenger cars by the 1980s. The interior-first design philosophy, the idea that the passenger cabin should be the starting point of the design process rather than an afterthought shaped around the engine and chassis, became the foundational principle of every minivan, crossover, and SUV that now dominates American roads. Stout had drawn the destination on the map in 1936. The industry spent 50 years finding its own way there.
William Bushnell Stout did not spend his final years in the comfortable obscurity that history sometimes assigns to men who arrive too early. He remained restlessly productive, which was the only mode he had ever known. In 1946, with the war finished and America experiencing the particular kind of optimism that comes from surviving something terrible, he built a second Scarab. This was not a revival of the original design, but a genuine evolution. A cleaner body, refined proportions, lessons absorbed from a decade of reflection on what the first car had gotten right and where it had fallen short. The second Scarab was, by most accounts of those who saw it, even more striking than the first. It generated press coverage. It generated admiration. It generated precisely zero production commitments from any manufacturer, for reasons that had less to do with the car than with the economics of a post-war industry racing to satisfy pent-up demand with the familiar products that consumers already understood and wanted. Stout continued writing and lecturing through the late 1940s and into the 50s, and his predictions maintained their uncomfortable habit of being accurate on substance and wildly optimistic on timing. He watched the Volkswagen Beetle arrive in the United States in the early 1950s and begin its slow, improbable conquest of a market that had been told for decades that small, economical, rear-engined cars were foreign curiosities unsuited to American roads and American appetites. By 1955, the Beetle was selling in numbers that nobody in Detroit had thought possible, and the executives who had dismissed Stout's rear-engine proposals 20 years earlier were quietly commissioning studies on whether American buyers might actually want something similar. The Chevrolet Corvair, launched in 1960, was General Motors' answer to that question, a rear-engined American compact that owed its basic philosophical premise to the same tradition Stout had been advocating since the Depression. Nobody sent him a royalty check. The fate of the original 9 Scarabs is a mystery that automotive historians approach with a resigned acceptance of people who know they will never have the complete answer. The historical record is fragmentary in ways that feel almost intentional. Several cars were damaged and scrapped during the 40s, when wartime material shortages made intact but unused vehicles look like collections of useful metal rather than irreplaceable artifacts. Others passed through private hands with minimal documentation, their whereabouts becoming uncertain with each successive sale. The most authoritative count of surviving examples places the number at somewhere between 4 and 6, depending on the condition threshold you apply and which partial restorations you are willing to count. Each one that surfaces at a major concours event, Pebble Beach, Amelia Island, stops the crowd in a way that very few automobiles manage, because even people who have never heard of William Stout can see immediately that they are looking at something that should not exist in the decade it was built. And then came 1984, and Lee Iacocca, and the Dodge Caravan. Chrysler's marketing machine announced the minivan as a revolution, a reinvention of the family vehicle, a breakthrough in interior packaging that would transform how Americans transported their families. The press largely agreed. The public absolutely agreed. The Caravan became one of the fastest-selling new vehicle launches in American automotive history. And within a decade, the minivan had replaced the station wagon as the definitive symbol of American family life. Aakash was celebrated as a visionary. The concept was presented as something entirely new.
It was not new. It was exactly what Stout had built in his Detroit workshop 48 years earlier, arrived at through a different mechanical route, but organized around an identical philosophical premise. The flat floor, the configurable interior, the prioritization of passenger space over mechanical convenience. The idea that a vehicle carrying a family should be designed around the family rather than around an engine layout inherited from the 1910s. Every single one of these principles had been demonstrated, working and drivable, in a car that 9 Americans had owned and driven before the Second World War had even begun. The industry that ignored Stout did not fail because it was populated by fools. It failed because large institutions are structurally incapable of following a single visionary ahead of the market. They can only follow the market itself, which moves in the slow, grinding consensus of millions of purchase decisions accumulating over years. Stout saw the destination. Detroit had to walk the whole road to get there. And when it finally arrived, the man who had built the signpost was 17 years in his grave, his name unknown to the journalists writing breathless copy about Chrysler's revolutionary new people mover. His 9 cars scattered between private collections and uncertain fates. His prediction fulfilled in every detail except the one that would have mattered to him most: the acknowledgement that he had been there first. That is the real story of the Stout Scarab. Not the story of a failure, but the story of an idea so correct and so complete that the industry needed half a century to catch up to it. And if that does not make you want to know more about the engineers and obsessives and stubborn dreamers who built the world we drive in today, then nothing will. Hit that like button right now. Drop a comment below telling us which forgotten automotive pioneer deserves the next story. And subscribe, because the most interesting cars in history are almost never the ones you already know about.